Here we're going to talk about the distribution of employment rents and how that occurs in terms of thinking through the no-shirking model. So, we know that a measure of contractual incompleteness is the likelihood that a worker who does not work well is detected and terminated. We saw a version of this in Chapter 10. Now, we saw how this worked in Chapter 10 with the extent of contractual incompleteness T affecting the distribution of rents between the agent, the subcontractor, and the principal, the buyer. Okay. Here we've got a similar thing between the principal, the employer, and the agent who's the worker. So let's think about this. We can rearrange B plus the employment, the no-shirking wage, WN. So there we have WN equals B plus U plus 1 minus T over TJ times U under bar. And we can think about the worker's employment rent, which depends on T. So the employment rent here is going to be WN minus then B plus underline U. And that leaves us with the employment rent. So recall, why do we do that? We want to subtract the unemployment benefits from the equilibrium wage, but we also want to subtract the disutility of work. When we take both of those things away from the Nash equilibrium wage, then we are left with the employment rent. So that's our basic intuition here. We can use this to think through what the employment rent will be. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to graph WN as a function of T, and we'll see what that's going to look like as we have different levels of J. Okay, so the first thing to ask is, before we do that though, is what wage does the employer have to offer the worker if T equals 1? What is the worker's employment rent at that point? So let's look at that quickly with this wage. So think through what's going to happen if T equals 1. So we've got using this, WN equals B plus U under bar U plus 1 minus T over TJ times U. If T equals 1, what do we have there? We've got a 0 in the numerator. Therefore, the worker's employment rent is 0. That whole thing there, it's going to be 0. Why? When T equals 1, we basically have a complete contract. What does the employer do in that case? They keep the worker at their participation constraint, which in this context would be B plus U. Okay, so let's look at this here. We've got the downward sloping wage offer as a function of T, which is T is along the horizontal axis here. And so what we're going to look at is, at a point such as T equal to 0.5, we can identify what the worker's rent will be, and we can identify too what the worker's, the employer's profit will be, given the productivity of the worker, gamma, and a price for the good. And we're going to just normalize that as 1. So we're going to say the price of the good is 1, and the worker's productivity is 1 as well. So with gamma equal to 1 and P equal to 1, what is the distribution of these rents going to be? We can see that when T equals 0.5, the worker has a rent there below the wage curve, but above their willingness to work. And what does the employer get? The employer gets the difference between gamma times P and the wage that they have to pay. So their benefit from what the worker provides is the worker's productivity, gamma, times the price at which they sell the good, P. Right? So gamma times P, that's basically the profit that the employer gets from employing that worker while paying them W. All right, so we can see what that's going to look like by looking at these this figure. So what are we seeing here? Just to summarize, we're visualizing how the degree of contractual incompleteness divides the total rents between the worker and the employer. So when T equals 1, the contract is complete. When T equals is lower than 1, the contract is less complete. So the basic intuition here is, as we're going from 0 to 1, the contract is becoming more complete. As we go from T equals 1 to T equals 0, the contract becomes less complete or more incomplete. Okay, so when thinking about that, when T equals less than T bar, that point down there, what are we going to say? The no-shirking wage would exceed the employer's revenue made possible by the worker's effort, WN greater than gamma times P. So important to think about here, if I can sell the goods based on worker productivity at gamma times P, and that's equal to 1, am I going to employ any workers at a wage which is higher than that. No, I'm not, right? I, as the employer, am not going to employ any workers because I'm paying them more than the benefit I receive from them at all. So I'm not going to do that. But at wages less than that point, what are we going to see? Employers will profit and workers who are employed will receive a rent. So as the contract becomes more and more complete, the distribution of rents is such that the employer gets more of the rents and the worker gets less of them. Now let's see what happens when we change the unemployment rate. So in our original graph, we had J set equal to 0.5. So that was the likelihood of you finding a job if you were terminated was about 50%. Now we're going to decrease that to 20%. So what does that mean? Your likelihood of finding a job is going to increase. There's less unemployment, and so the chance that you're going to get rehired is higher. Your chance of remaining jobless is lower. So when there is a lower rate of joblessness or a lower rate of unemployment, you're going to be more likely to get rehired pretty quickly. And so what that does in terms of the distribution between workers and employers is it means that workers are going to get a larger share of the rents of the surplus when there is lower unemployment. They're going to be able to demand a higher wage from workers based on the no-shirking wage. So no, this first line, the lower one, is when there was where there was more unemployment. The higher line is when there is less unemployment. Okay, and you are more likely to be re-employed as a worker who is terminated. What does that do to the share of the rents for you as a worker? You get a higher share of the rents for a given degree of contractual incompleteness. So, just to summarize that, the labor market conditions are going to affect the distribution of rents. When J2, the rate of joblessness, is equal to 0.5, there is high unemployment and the probability a terminated worker is rehired is only 50%. Now, if the probability of remaining jobless was 0.2, that's 20%, then what that does is it increases the worker's employment rent. Why is it doing that? I leave that for you to answer, but think to yourself, what is happening to the worker's fallback position and happening to the incentive compatibility constraint as J goes down? So go back to the incentive compatibility constraint and the Nash equilibrium no-shirking wage and see what decreasing J does there. Okay, so how do we apply this? Well, we can look at an application to this in the way that technology can make a contract more complete. So one example is from two authors, Baker and Hubbard, in 2004, and they examined these things called trip recorders. And what trip recorders do is they record on trucks the ability to, basically the speed at which trucks are going and what the truck's driver is doing. So think of it as like a kind of initial GPS, but on trucks for logistics companies. And so what this meant is that it increased the ability of employers to monitor the action of truck drivers. Now, what this did is that it meant that the company could get verifiable information they could take to a third party about the behavior of the truck drivers. They could also detect idling time. They could also think about other details of the trucks that the truck drivers were engaging in. So the important thing here is about speed and idling and also what the truck driver did and what time they were driving at, okay, importantly. So what this did is it induced truck drivers to, with the recorders, to drive more slowly, and also it reduced the costs of operation of the company-owned trucks. The drivers had to treat the trucks better than they would have done previously. Now, what are the knock-on effects of this? There's a variety of them, and let's think about them. What we saw is that there was a marked decline in the share of owner-operators. So an owner-operator is someone who owns their own truck and operates that truck. So those people previously who owned their own trucks and worked in the logistics field, they already drove in a way where they behaved responsibly and where they looked after their trucks and where they didn't drive too quickly. People who didn't own their trucks and who worked for another company but weren't monitored before the trip recorders, they drove quickly, they would often take longer rests, and they wouldn't treat the truck as well. But with the advent of trip recorders, they basically had their behavior monitored all the time, and so they started to behave as owner-operators would. in a way that was more compatible with what employers wanted. But here's the problem, right? Owner-operators, they do not have economies of scale like big companies do. So they were treating their trucks well, but they don't have the same economies of scale as the big companies do. And so the big companies with both economies of scale and a more complete contract were able to drive owner-operators basically out of business. And what we saw there is less competition in the trucking industry and much greater inequality. Another example of this is how employers can monitor workers using cameras or monitoring keystrokes on workers' computers. So what you can see there is that there's a variety of work that is currently going on, and there are all kinds of technologies that you can think about where where employers monitor the behavior of workers. You can think about how Amazon warehouses would often equip workers with the GPSs to detect how quickly they were doing different tasks. So individual workers are being monitored significantly in warehouses, in their everyday work, in what they do in computers. And so this is monitored, tracked, quantified in order to make the contract more complete and in order for the employer to get a larger share of the economic rents in their interaction with the worker. Now, an important thing here, though, is that monitoring affects human motivation. And so what can sometimes happen here is that when you don't monitor me, I behave in a trustworthy way. So if you treat me with trust, I behave in a trustworthy way and I exert a lot of effort. But there is a variety of evidence from behavioral economics suggesting that when people try to monitor you very closely, then you might respond to them by saying, no, screw you, I'm going to exert less effort now that you're monitoring me very closely. I'm only going to exert the minimum amount of effort required. I'm not going to go above and beyond. Okay, whereas previously people would say, oh, you're trusting me, I'm going to exert even more effort than you require of me because I'm in a nice job where I'm trusted by my employer. Okay, but in the case where you start getting monitored very closely, that trust vanishes and people just say, I'm just going to do the minimum required. I'm not going to do everything I might have done previously. So that can backfire.